Hello, welcome back to my channel. If you have ever wondered how websites like YouTube or Amazon show you personalized content or how they filter search results just for you, well, the secret lies in URL and query parameters. And in this video, we'll break down FastAPI query and path parameters. This will enable you to build dynamic user-friendly APIs in minutes. So, let's go to our editor and I will explain to you step by step how to implement the FastAPI query parameters and the path parameters. If you have not set up your FastAPI project, make sure you pip install FastAPI and UVCon. Now that we've created our FastAPI app, the next thing we want to do is to look at the path parameters, which are dynamic URLs. Path parameters let you capture values from the URL itself. For example, fetching a user by ID. Let's create a simple endpoint that returns a user's details based on their ID. Using the app that we created, we're going to be using the app decorator with a get method to an endpoint of users, which will take a path parameter of user ID. And let's create a function get user, which will take in the user ID that we receive from our URL into our function. And the data type of the user ID is an integer. So what we're doing here now is this endpoint, whenever you visit users / whatever ID of the user that you pass to it, it's going to be passed, the user ID will be passed to our get user function, which will in turn return the user information. So let's return the user information with a dictionary of user ID, which of course will be the user ID that we are receiving, and we want to just give the name of the user, which this time will be John. Now, if you hit users /42, FastAPI will extract 42 as user ID and it's going to return it. Let's see how this works in our Swagger documentation. But before I launch the Swagger documentation, I'm going to serve a app using UVCon. So UVCon main app, then reload. This is going to serve our application and we'll be able to access the Swagger documentation where we'll be able to test out our endpoint. So let's go to 127.0.0, which is our localhost on port 8000/docs. This is going to load up our Swagger documentation where we'll be able to access our API. Now, as you can see, when we hit the user's endpoint, it is important that we pass the user ID as shown in the Swagger documentation here. So what this is telling us that when you are using the path parameter or the dynamic URL, it is important that you pass the parameter to the endpoint. Unlike query parameters, which of course we're going to touch in a bit, which does not make it compulsory for you to pass the query parameters. But when you're using the path parameter, it is very important for you to pass the user ID to the endpoint. So if we pass, let's try it out, then pass an ID of 1, then we execute. And here you can see we're now having user ID of 1 as a response and the name as John. If we go back here and change this to 12, then execute again, then we are getting the user ID of 12 and the name John. So what this allows us to do is to use a single endpoint for multiple users. So you don't have to recreate your endpoint for each of the user ID. With this single endpoint, It becomes dynamic when you are using path parameters or dynamic URL. Now that we know how path parameters or dynamic URL works, the next thing we want to do is to implement how we use our query parameters. Like I said, query parameters are not really compulsory. You can choose to pass them and you can choose to not pass them. Now let's implement query parameters. Query parameters are perfect for all optional filters like pagination or search terms. They appear after a question mark in the URL. So let's make an endpoint that filters books by the author. So we're going to say we define our endpoint still using a get, and we're going to define our function to get books, and we're going to define author, which is going to be a string, and the default value is going to be all. Do a limit of 10. Then we'll return a dictionary that says author is going to be author. The limit is going to be the limit that we defined as well. Then we're going to return, let's say, books 1 and book 2. Now, if you go to books endpoint and you pass the author with a limit, it is going to come into our endpoint and replace what we defined as a default here. The reason we define a default is if a user does not pass anything, then this is going to act as our fallback. So this is going to be the default. But if a user sets another thing, then whatever the user passed to the endpoint becomes the new value. So let's go back to our Swagger documentation and see how this works. Let's reload our Swagger documentation and we should have our new endpoint added, which of course we can see here. So if you open up this, we can see now. Note the difference between the query parameter and the path parameter. If you're looking at this now, it says author, which is a string, and is indicating that this is a query parameter. And this is our default value, which is all, which was set in our code here. And the limit of 10, which we already set in our code as well. So this is telling us that this is a string, the author is a string, and the limit is an integer. But if you notice that there is no asterisk and there is nothing like required under the query parameters, unlike the path parameter where it is compulsory for you to pass it. So if we execute the books endpoint without passing any value to it, our code will still work. Now we get our information even without changing any value. But if you go back to change the value of author to TechUX, I will say we want a limit of 20. The moment we execute this endpoint, it's going to set the new value of author in our function to TechUX, and it's going to set the limit to 20. So let's execute this. Now we have 20 and we have TechUX, and that is the beauty of the query parameter and the path parameter in FastAPI. Now that we've understood the difference between the path parameter, which is the dynamic URL, and the query parameter, which is the optional filter, now that we've understood what a query parameter and a path parameter is, that will be all for this video. Drop a comment if you want a deep dive into request bodies or authentication in our next video. Hit the like button, subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Happy coding.